Well, people, we did it. Episode 100. Harvard Business School professor and leadership guru on the art of failing well, Amy Edmondson. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Amy Edmondson. Amy is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School, renowned for her research on psychological safety over 20 years. Her award-winning work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Psychology Today, Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, and more. Named by Thinkers 50 in 2021 as the #1 management thinker in the world, Amy's TED Talk, How to Turn a Group of Strangers into a Team, has been viewed over 3 million times. She received her PhD, AM and AB from Harvard University, and her latest book is titled The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. Amy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I think I mentioned this as my 100th episode.
That's so exciting.
It is, and I don't often say that about things I do, but I think the first drop I had, episode number 1, was back in March of 2017. This is 6.5 years in the making. And so apropos that this is the 100th episode, because this talk is a lot about intelligent failure. And when I started this episode 6 years ago, I really started it as an experiment, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And I'm guessing the very first one I did, and the second and the third one, were failures. If you're measuring by any number of attributes, audience size, engagement, content quality, audio quality, interview technique, et cetera, but, you listen to the interview, you ask for feedback, you try to figure out what worked, what didn't work, and you try again and again and again. And as the saying goes, you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you start all over again. So anyway, perfect topic to mark this milestone. So thank you.
That's exactly right, though. The way you describe it, it's perfect. And it's something I study and write about. And I love how true that is. And it's still easier said than done.
It's way easier said than done. And we're going to dig into all the reasons why that is. But, what's interesting is if you were to ask me, has this 6.5 year experiment been a success or a failure? And I'm just being straight honest here. I don't know what I'd say. And I'll tell you why, Amy, because it all depends what you're measuring. I've got a nice audience, but it's not a top 10 podcast. Spotify hasn't called in the last week or two asking if I could accept $200 million like Joe Rogan. I'm not a household name. Now, that said, I absolutely love doing this. Right now, at this time, in this moment, there is honestly nothing in the world I'd rather be doing right this minute than interviewing you. And I mean that with all sincerity. I learned so much. I get so inspired by talking to talented guests like you. So from that perspective, it's a wild success. Anyway, sorry to begin the interview with a long rambling.
No, but it's important because we're, in a way, we're diving right in. First of all, you get to choose. I mean, not, within reason, you get to choose the metrics. I don't get to choose. The world doesn't get to choose. I mean, for me, a few metrics that pop up right away is the one you just ended with, which is, do you enjoy it? Is it fulfilling? Is it giving you a sense of meaning and accomplishment? Then that's one important criterion. But more simply, it doesn't have to be top 10. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of podcasts. So a question I would have is, has it grown? Has it grown? Has it continued to attract listeners? If when someone listens to it, do they sort of want to tell a friend or two about it? That's success.
It's grown. I feel like I've gotten better. I'd like to think that I've gotten better. I'd like to think that the caliber of guests continues to escalate, and the quality of the content, keeps growing. But there's sort of a question behind the statement that you started to get at, right? Which is in order to define whether something was a success or a failure, you have to start by defining what the goal even is to begin with.
Exactly. Absolutely. And in fact, I define intelligent failures in part as an undesired event that occurs in pursuit of a goal. So you have to know what that goal is to even have that be present.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're aware that Walter Isaacson just came out with a new book on Elon Musk. And so it just got me thinking about SpaceX. And I sort of followed the story from the beginning. And the current Falcon 9 rocket, it has been a wild success, like over a 99% success rate. But its first rocket was the Falcon 1. And you couldn't have a Falcon 9 without the Falcon 1. And the first 3 launches of the Falcon 1 were failures. Yes. They all crashed. And so had they employed, let's say, a never fail twice policy, the company wouldn't exist today. So they had to define a failure more narrowly, if you will, than just a rocket not completing its mission. Like, in other words, there had to be, okay, there's some learning we're going to get here,
right?
Even if it's going to crash again and again, right? So that sort of comes back to the measurement criteria.
Right. And I would hope, and I don't know the nitty-gritty details of the Falcon experiments, but I would hope and assume that the second failure was not the mirror image of the first. It wasn't, it doesn't take off at the same angle. It doesn't go exactly as long and in the same direction and then come back and fail in exactly the same way. Then that truly would be a not so intelligent failure. But the chances are very good that something that complex and novel was not figure outable after just one try. So when you say don't fail twice, or at least when I say don't fail twice, don't produce the exact same failure twice. Right? It should be a nice little variation on that failure. So when Thomas Edison purportedly said, I haven't failed, I found 10,000 ways that didn't work, we can applaud and emulate that. But that's in fact what it's all about. You don't get to a phonograph or an electric light on the second try.
Yeah. So the modern day Thomas Edison, at all these Silicon Valley startups, we've got this fail fast, fail often. It's an oft-used mantra that we've all heard before. But what you've done in this book that I really liked is you've peeled back to look at, well, a failure isn't a failure isn't a failure. There are different kinds of failures. Some are good, some are not so good. So to start, you distinguish between good and bad failures. So what's the difference?
Well, the main difference is that a good failure is an undesired outcome that brings you new knowledge that could not have been gained any other way. Right? You couldn't have looked it up in the literature. You couldn't have asked a friend what will happen if, because you were in new territory. So you're in that awkward position of you have to just try it. You have to have your first podcast before you know whether, it's terrible or unfun or, all of the rest of the things it could have been. So an intelligent failure, which is the good kind, right kind of wrong, as the title of the book indicates, is in new territory. And so you don't have an option to just to do this and find the knowledge some other way. It's in pursuit of a goal, as we already discussed. It's driven by a hypothesis. And if not a formal hypothesis, at least you have good reason to believe this might work, or this is in the direction of it might work. And then finally, and I think the part that is often left out of the rhetoric, the Silicon Valley rhetoric, is it should be as small as possible. It should be just big enough to get new information without wasting unnecessary time or resources or reputation.
There is someone I interviewed a couple years back, Bob Lefkowitz. He won the Nobel in chemistry, some incredible discovery. I don't even remember how to pronounce it, but it really has transformed modern medicine. And I remember him mentioning this stat that even for Nobel laureates like him, the best scientists in the world, that they fail 98% of the time. If you think about classic science experimentation, would those be intelligent failures?
Absolutely. In fact, that's where the idea or the concept comes from, or at least for me, that's where it comes from. And so then I say, okay, what do scientists know? What do scientists do that the rest of us aren't as comfortable doing? And the reason why that's a good place to look is that their job is finding new stuff, figuring out things that work, finding new knowledge that may transform how medicines are delivered, for example. That's their stated job. So if they're doing it well at all, they're on the leading edge, they are having failures. So the Nobel winning scientists, the elite athletes, the innovators, they are not the ones who fail less often than you or me. They're the ones who fail more often than you and me, because they know that to really push the craft that they are working toward, they must fail, right? They must, or better way to say that, they don't want to fail. Nobody wants to fail, but they must try things for which the results are not yet a given, right? Not yet necessarily going to work the way they had wanted. But I've never met a scientist who didn't prefer that her hypothesis was right.
Mm-hmm.
But they understand that this is the game I've chosen to play. I've chosen to play a game where, even if I'm a Nobel Prize winner, I'll fail, some huge percentage of the time.
Which doesn't mean that it's easy for them to accept it.
No, in fact, my husband's a scientist, and I can't tell you how many times, he came home crestfallen because those cells just didn't behave, right? The thing that they thought, oh, we're gonna, do this thing and it's gonna cure something, or it's going to be a groundbreaking discovery in biology, and they were wrong, right? Again and again and again. I asked him once years ago, as I was first starting to think about this, so it's like 20 years ago, I asked him to tell me what percent of the experiments run in his lab, and he had about 30 young scientists working with him at the time, end in failure. And in my brain, I'm thinking it's going to be like 65%. And he said 70. And I thought, yes. And then I realized that wasn't very supportive spousal behavior, really, but it was reassuring to be sort of almost right. But he said, yeah, no, I think 70%. Again, different fields have different rates. So that doesn't negate what Bob said, but it's not fun. You never give up hoping that you're right, but you learn to live with the disappointments because the 30% are so darn exciting.
So just to dig in a little bit to this notion of intelligent failure, you distinguish it from complex failures and something else called that you coined a basic failure. So as I understand it, a basic failure is when we know how to achieve a desired outcome, but we don't use all the knowledge at our fingertips.
Yes.
So they're essentially preventable.
They're preventable.
So give an example of a basic failure.
They're not easy to, it's not easy to be perfect, or it's not easy to use all the knowledge that we have or all the knowledge that our team has or the world has. But it's at least theoretically possible. So, a stupid example of a basic failure would be you put sugar in the recipe instead of salt by mistake, or the other way around, and you ruin the cookies. And it's a failure. You've wasted all those ingredients and that time, and you have nothing, no dessert. Mm-hmm. It's a good example simply because there was a recipe and you just made a mistake. A more modern or sophisticated example would be the time about 3 years ago when some employees at Citibank accidentally wired $800 million to a corporate client by mistake because they essentially checked the wrong boxes. And they essentially wired the whole principal rather than just the interest on a loan. And they were unable to get it back. Right? And a judge ruled against them with a controversial finders keepers ruling, right? So that's a kind of tiny little human error that should have been, triple checked before, but it wasn't. We've all been there. Well, maybe not with that kind of money at stake, but we've all made simple mistakes. Many of them, thankfully, don't lead to any kind of substantial failure, but some do. So that's a basic failure. Single cause, human error. Don't use the knowledge you had.
So I'm going off memory here in the book. Was there an example with this brilliant scientific husband of yours of his trying to make octopus?
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
It didn't go so well. Was this a basic failure? Or?
He would disagree with me on this. I mean, it was terrible. Everybody agreed it was terrible. But I think George would be tempted to say it was a complex failure, like a complex set of factors came together to create this horrible dish. But I think it's basic because I think it's a very tricky thing to cook, apparently, and you should follow a recipe super carefully, not make one up. Sorry, George.
Sorry, George. Don't come after me. Okay, complex failures. What are those?
Complex failures are multi-causal. They're the kinds of failures that happen when a number of factors come together in just the wrong way, the perfect storm. And the key here is that usually none of the factors alone would have been adequate to cause the failure. It was the odd confluence of them that came together. Your alarm clock doesn't go off, your phone isn't fully charged, and unexpectedly large traffic, and you're late for a really important meeting and can't make a call, right? So it's a failure that any one of those things, if you'd only been able to make the call, or if the traffic hadn't lined up, or the alarm clock hadn't malfunctioned, whatever, right? So they all came together and led to a failure.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm.
It's a perfect storm.
You mentioned, I think the Boeing 737 fatal crashes. Those are examples of complex failures.
Yes, they are absolutely not attributable to one mistake or one failure to do something correctly. It's a combination of competitive forces, an unexpected announcement by Airbus that they were coming out with this new, more fuel efficient plane, the belief that we had to get there fast, the belief that the 737 as it was could be sort of stretched max. And that changes the aerodynamics a little bit, but software can handle that. Oops, if we require training, our customers, that is the airlines, the companies, don't like it because that's expensive for them. We actually don't believe it's a big deal. Oh, and then we've moved our headquarters from our manufacturing, and we've sort of lost our mojo on the engineering side. Take any one of those things out, we would have prevented those catastrophic losses several years ago. It sort of took the perfect storm. Just because it's a complex failure doesn't mean there's no fault to be found, right? But it does mean it's complicated.
Right. Is the point in this case that it should have never happened?
Well, to me, the point is that there were many points at which it could have been interrupted. The complex failures present us with all these different opportunities to catch and correct, before harm occurs. We often don't do it well enough because we don't stop to think through the implications of our actions. You don't stop to think through the implications of moving corporate headquarters several thousand miles away and sort of disrupting that beautiful connection between the executives and the engineers. Right? We don't think that one through, and so you're left with a catastrophic outcome that nobody wanted.
Yeah, I remember when it happened quite vividly, and it was a shock the first time, but it was such a bigger shock the second time. Like you would think from the first one, whether it was let's just put all of this on hold and we need to have a training session or more simulator time or whatever it is.
Yes. So that, I think, was a failure to learn from the failure. And that's also a rather common problem because it's very easy. When we know this from our lives, right? When something goes wrong, we're quick to jump to an explanation, and usually an explanation that takes us off the hook. And so, the easy and obvious explanation on the first crash was, well, those aren't the kind of experienced pilots that we have, in Europe and in the United States. It's sort of a newer airline and a younger country in economic terms. And so there was easy stereotyping that led it to be, it must be sort of the fault of the pilots. Faulty thinking, mm-hmm. Absolutely, right? But unchallenged, because it becomes, when you come with your explanation, it's like it's sealed up, it's self-sealing. You think, all right, we're right, we're done, we better move on. Whereas after the second one, they couldn't do that anymore.
Well, I'm just trying to think through how we learn from these. And I get that we don't want them to happen. I mean, people lost their lives, of course. But what I'm curious about is how much systems thinking goes into these. So you could, the simple solution is, let's make sure that pilots are trained on that very specific. I think it was some way that automatically adjusts the nose down when you have a pitch too high because they had to shift the
yes, location. And then you don't know what happened.
And you don't know what happened. So maybe there's an easy fix for that specific problem. But there's a broader
failure to think systemically.
Are we doing that? Like, do you think they've said, whenever we now go forward, I'm not trying to put Boeing in the spotlight, but in general, when these things happen, how good are we? How good are our companies or organizations at, sort of pulling up, if you will, and looking at the broader patterns and saying, okay, this isn't just about a specific issue of an automated system that pushes the nose down. This is about how we aren't having the right communication protocols between our developers and our pilots, or we don't have enough simulation training, or whatever it is. It's preventing a whole class of problems in the future. Is that something that we tend to fail at as well?
Yes. And, there's two aspects to it. One is we just put off the work of doing it, or we fail to recognize the mission critical nature of doing that work, right? That because there are the good, as we talked about before, the good kind of failures and the not so good, but both of them offer lessons, right? But we have an obligation, I would argue, to learn from both of them. But we're not all that enthusiastic about learning from failures of any kinds. Maybe, scientists are more likely to do it because that's sort of their bread and butter. But we don't easily think through the systemic effects, right? So complex failures happen because our systems are complex, and we rarely do the due diligence to say, okay, if we add this nice little feature that seems like a nice feature to add, any system, not talking about Boeing, and then I wonder how that might impact other aspects of the system, of the organization, of our business model, what have you, and really think it through. And that's kind of a team sport too, to step back and say, okay, what might happen if? Who's got another idea? What are we missing here? And let's walk it through. Let's walk through the possible implications. And that's a kind of work that I think often feels wasteful or not productive for us human beings. So we sort of think, no, we got to get on with it. We got to be productive, right? We spend all this time nowadays, especially just being busy, but not necessarily stepping back to think it through. I remember Peter Senge, who's the great, system dynamicist and systems thinker, who flipped the phrase, don't just stand there, do something. He said, don't just do something, stand there. And I loved that.
So back to intelligent failures, and your husband has it right. Bob Lefkowitz, has it right. All the scientists out there, most of us, we know it's important. It's not like we don't understand that we learn from failure, but we're not good at it. We, as you put it, we fail at failing. So what are the primary culprits around that, and how do we change that?
Well, I think the primary culprit is the wrong-headed belief that we're supposed to be perfect, or that we're supposed to be, good at things. We're supposed to not fail. Mm-hmm. And so when we experience failures, we find them somewhere between embarrassing and downright shameful. And we don't want to be, you look to your right, look to your left. Did anyone see me, do that? And it's not consistent with the self-image you have somewhat north of, say, second grade. And before then, you're just perfectly happy to kind of mess up and try stuff and see what happens. But somewhere along the way, it's our social environment teaches us that we want to look good and we want to get the right answer. And it just becomes a habit.
You coined the term psychological safety.
Not exactly. I coined the term team psychological safety, which I know doesn't sound like much, especially since everybody's giving me credit for the other one. But psychological safety was already in the literature.
Okay.
It wasn't all that popular. I mean, it wasn't, it hadn't attracted as much attention, at least in the management or organizational behavior fields, but it had been written about in the past. And then my empirical observation was that this sort of interpersonal climate varied substantially across teams in the same organizations. And that seemed like really interesting and substantively important, right? If this little group that I work with shapes my thinking about what I can and can't speak up about, then that's going to shape our ability to learn. That's going to shape our ability to experiment or ask for help when we're in over our head and all the rest.
Well, you're sort of alluding to it, but could you, for those that aren't familiar with the term, could you just define simply psychological safety is what?
It's a belief that I can take interpersonal risks without fear of punishment or rejection. So what's an interpersonal risk? Well, it's anything where there's a risk that you might think less well of me as a result. Like if I ask for help, you might think, oh, you're not as smart as I thought you were. Or if I admit a mistake, same thing. Or if I offer an idea that, you think, God, that's a stupid idea. Right? So people are very anxious to have others think well of them. And it's just always easier to hold back, right? Wait and see. Like not speaking up is easier than speaking up.
So let me try to connect some dots here. And I will assume you and I have a psychologically safe environment here, so you can correct me. So without psychological safety, you can't create a learning organization. And without a learning organization, there's no room for failure. So you almost need psychological safety, not almost, but you really do need it as a prerequisite for cultivating a culture of intelligent failure. Am I getting that?
Absolutely. It's exactly right. And in recent weeks, I've started talking about, and it's in the book too, but I've just started I've started using the term more often, that a healthy failure culture, which is really kind of synonymous with a psychologically safe culture. But I like it because I think it's very easy to see how you could have a healthy failure culture in an organization, right? And that would be one where you are hell-bent on preventing preventable failures. Right? You're going to speak up when you don't like what those executives are doing in headquarters. You're going to, conduct crazy, wonderful experiments in R&D, all of it, right? All of it is part of a healthy failure culture. But I like it because it also seems to me to apply to, families and life settings too, where we've got to make it okay for people to mess up and make mistakes, but also share wild ideas or share their dreams. I mean, that's the kind of family you want to be in. That's the kind of friendship group you want to be in.
So one of the people I also interviewed, not to make this about my podcast, but it's just interesting listening to you. I don't know if you know who Eileen Collins is. She was the first, and I believe only, female commander and pilot of the space shuttle. And she was known not just for being a brilliant, space shuttle pilot, but her leadership chops. So they later asked her if she could lead the postmortem investigation over the Space Shuttle Columbia accident, which they came to learn was as much about culture as it was anything else, because they didn't have this notion of psychological safety. You seem to be pretty familiar with that. Can you share that story?
Yeah, this is a case study that I've spent a lot of time on, and it is in fact literally a textbook example of an environment where no bad guys, right? There's nobody sort of trying to be a bully or trying to keep voice down, but strong and powerful beliefs in hierarchy, in who should say what to whom, that unless you're really confident, it's a very engineering culture, right? So, if you're going to speak up and say you think something is not working or at risk, you better have your data and you better have it buttoned down, or at least that was the belief system that people had internalized. So in an atmosphere where, let's face it, there's going to be a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty. What you want for excellence is for people to speak up, to give, the benefit of doubt to speaking up. But what you had instead was, with doubt, people stayed quiet. And that there was doubt, and that led directly to the mission management team meeting when it had a crucial discussion halfway through the mission. The mission management team is on the ground about a potential anomaly, a foam strike that had been witnessed in post-launch video, but oh so abstract. Just a grainy speck on the video was essentially what was visible. But that grainy speck gave at least one engineer pause. And in the mission management team meeting, which that engineer is not, part of that formal august group, but on the periphery of that meeting, when the issue was discussed and it was dismissed by higher ups as a maintenance issue only, no safety of flight, that engineer wanted to say, I'm not so sure about that, but literally felt it wasn't possible because, as he put it, she, meaning mission management director Linda Ham, is way up here and I'm way down here, gesturing with his hands, a kind of hierarchy. And so that's the very epitome of not psychologically safe in an environment where you would really want it to be one of candor and directness and I don't get it and help me out here and all right, who sees it differently, right? You'd want all of that great learning oriented language. We didn't have it. I think Columbia was a wake-up call for the culture that led the organization to take a good hard look at its culture and say, we have met the enemy, and it is our culture.
Yeah. And I know you've done a lot of work in healthcare settings. My father, retired now, was a surgeon. My sister is a surgeon. And I remember as a kid going in and being able to watch one of the procedures. I mean, there certainly was a hierarchy. There was a pecking order. I can't imagine back in the day that there was a psychologically safe environment in the OR. So has that changed? Has that evolved?
It has. It has. And let me try to be very clear about this, which is hierarchy is not the enemy, right? Hierarchy itself is not the problem. It's how hierarchy is handled that matters. So I do not want to take away the authority of a surgeon in the operating room ever, right? And I do want that surgeon to absolutely make clear to everyone in the room, if you see something off, even the 1% chance of something off, say it, right? I need you. You are my eyes and ears. While I'm, might be busy doing something else, suturing or whatever. So when people who are higher in the hierarchy go out of their way to say, I might miss something, I need to hear from you. When they ask good questions, when they make clear that this is a place where dissenting voices are welcome, then, hierarchy is put to its good use. The person has the role, the responsibility, the authority to manage this very important process, but also has the wisdom to know that they are not superhuman and they depend on the work and observations of others to make sure to deliver failure-free performance.
Talk to me about it. It feels like on the one level, a culture of accountability is somewhat antithetical to, back to this term, the psychological safe culture and embracing failure. But you say, no, it's a false dichotomy. So I'd love to hear why that is.
The problem with the word accountability is that it's too often equated with or connected in your mind with punishment, or that, there will be consequences if you screw up or don't succeed or do fail. But the real root of that word is taking account of, right? Telling the story honestly from your perspective, your experience, like being willing to own your contribution to the failure, your contribution to the suboptimal result, while also fully analyzing and trying to understand what else happened here. Like, where was I wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Where was I right? I mean, where what didn't happen the way I had hoped it would? That ability to give a clear-eyed account of what happened and to feel a sense of responsibility and ownership for what happened. That's, I think, the true meaning of accountability. But I mean, I think a highly accountable culture is one in which people are accountable to each other to do the very best they can, to be honest about where they come up short and so on, rather than one in which, oh yeah, there will be consequences. Because I think that kind of accountability basically leads people to not share what's really going on, to not tell the truth.
Yeah. Well, and then to carry it all the way through, you'd like to think that come performance evaluation time, that they say, listen, Glenn, you have quote unquote failed twice here, but these were smart failures. We've learned so much in terms of gaining institutional knowledge. We've all benefit from this. So even though they weren't successful, there's going to be a raise, there's going to be a big bonus, there's going to be maybe a promotion. And we certainly don't carry it that far. Like the most it feels like we take it is maybe not there being retribution or punishment,
but not reward.
Not reward.
And I think that's wrongheaded, right? Because, the easiest way to not fail at all is to not take risks at all. And that's fine for today, but 5 years from now, we'll be out of business, right? If people don't take the risks that, say, innovation necessarily entails. And so the pursuit of excellence, like if you want to give it a short-term lens, we know how to do that, like follow instructions and take no risks, right? But the pursuit of excellence over time is necessarily going to be a process that involves taking risks, because otherwise you're not helping to invent the future, the products and services or markets or what have you that are going to help us grow and stay relevant in a changing world. So much of this depends upon, I mean, I think what you said is true, that people never, they rarely get rewarded for the failures. They get maybe not punished, but I think we do have to reward them. Again, they ought to be thoughtful experiments. You had good reason to believe it could work, and then it didn't. As opposed to just either recklessness or, mail it in kind of behavior.
Let me ask you, Amy, you were talking earlier about how, as children, we start out in the world with all about curiosity and learning. And then somehow over time we get into defensiveness and self-protection. This notion that we have to be right to be worthy, to be accepted. And that sort of stays hardwired in a lot of us, through our adulthood. And maybe this is going too far out of our or your territory here, but I'm just wondering, based on one's upbringing, is it possible that it's easier for some people to rewire themselves, so to speak, as they become adults and go back to that curiosity and learning mode, and others it's just really, really hard to ever get out of that notion of perfectionism, if you will.
Yes, and this definitely goes well beyond my data, right? My expertise, but my experience is, my observation is, yes, it is considerably harder for some than others. And I'll draw on two things. One is Carol Dweck's great work on growth mindset, and I think for those rare families and rare kids who were given strong growth and learning mindsets as children and developing adults, it is easier. When there was more conversation about process and more acceptance of, what did you learn and what went wrong and how did that go, and what hard thing are you going to try tomorrow? Then there's just less allergy and sense of I'm going to die if I'm found out, right? The imposter syndrome. The other thing will call on is Chris Argyris, who was a great thinker in organizational learning and sort of management conversation. He was all about how our mental models get in the way of our having real conversations from which we actually learn. And he wrote an article in Harvard Business Review in the early 90s called Teaching Smart People How to Learn. And essentially was how some of these very high achieving young people that, go to schools like mine and go off to investment banks and consulting firms are pretty used to getting straight A's and a little, his word, brittle. And I read the article and I said, oh, Chris, I said, I'm worried a little because I'm pretty brittle. He says, yes, but you're not brittle about being brittle. And I thought, that's it, eureka, right? It's like, because I get it, like I see it, I can sort of dispassionately take a look at myself and see that, yeah, I really want to get it right. I really don't want to be imperfect. I don't like failing, but I can see it. I can talk about it. It's discussable. It's even funny, right? The degree to which I can embody non-learning mindsets and behaviors is amusing to me, right? Because I should know better, right? This is what I study.
Yeah.
So he was exactly right. And of course, Chris was known for something called double loop learning. And what he was basically saying was you're capable of that double loop. You can see yourself falling into that trap and you can pick yourself back out of it.
You mentioned reframing as a technique that people can use, one of the techniques to help us learn from failure. Can you talk about that?
Well, reframing means, take a look at an event or a situation and realize that your automatic way of making sense of it, of judging it, if you will, is not the only way to think about it. You have the choice to rethink, reframe, think about the same set of events or situation differently, right? So you're late for that meeting and your pulse is going up, you're in the traffic and you're thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be late for the meeting. I'm going to, I'm not going to get the job or I'm not going to get the sale. And if you really start following that thinking, you're kind of exaggerating the awfulness of it. And there's some part of you that's just saying, I'm going to die, right? If I don't make it to that meeting on time, I'm going to die, which is obviously false. So reframing would be to go from, oh, this is so awful and I am so upset and anxious to, okay, this is inconvenient, very inconvenient, but I will make amends, right? I'll apologize. Next time I'll set out earlier or what have you. So it's that ability to step back, challenge the automatic thinking, and come up with a healthier, more productive, more learning-oriented way to think about the same situation. And it's a skill, and it can be learned, and it can be practiced.
Yeah. Can I share a story, a personal story?
Yes, please.
It was a few years ago. I was interviewing for a new EA, a new assistant. And after I was done with my questions, I turned the floor over to her. I said, what can I tell you? She said, I'd just love to hear your backstory. And I said, well, it's not all that interesting. And I proceeded to talk through, I've had a lot of past lives, a chapter in Silicon Valley doing startups and a chapter doing real estate development, a chapter at Goldman Sachs doing investments. But each one financially, if I get back to the early part of our conversation, how do you measure it? Financially, none of them really panning out. I mean, my company almost went public, but then right into the eye of the dot-com bubble in 2000. And then the real estate right in the 2008 crash, on and on and on, into the world of finance when all the post-2008 SEC lawsuits were coming out and what have you. So by the time I was done, I said, probably you're not going to even want to work here, but now that you've heard all that. And she just sat there and paused, Amy, and she looked at me and she said, wow. And I said, wow, that bad? She said, no, you're like a real Renaissance man. I said, what are you talking about? And I hope this doesn't come across, this wasn't me. And by the way, I'm no Benjamin Franklin, but what she said was, you've had a chance to live all of these lives. Like, wow, you had a whole, number of years in startups in Silicon Valley in the thick of the internet boom, and you're doing skyscraper development and all of these things. And so through her lens, it's like, wow, what an incredible a number of lives that you've
Yeah,
been able to live,
adventures.
it sort of maybe was a little embarrassing, or maybe humbling is the right word, to have a complete stranger reframe for me.
Yeah, right.
But it really helped.
Isn't that amazing? Because in a way you were saying, like, don't follow me around because everything I touch, seems to fall apart. But what she saw was, wow, imagine all those not only adventures, but really different areas of expertise that you were willing to just throw yourself into.
Yeah, I'm sitting there fixated on financial success at the time, and she's not even listening to that. She's not even thinking about that. I mean, back to this whole notion of failure. The reason this is called The Art of Excellence, this podcast, not The Art of Success, is I feel like success is already predefined in our heads, right? And I'll ask you in a little bit how you define excellence. But with failure, I feel like it's the same thing. It almost like the very notion that you're trying to segment good kinds of failure versus bad kinds, it's just that word failure. And it conjures up so many feelings and emotions. And so I almost think like I know it seems like semantics on the one hand, but it almost feels like we need a different word to define what that is. So it doesn't feel like we're accepting something that has such a negative connotation, even though it shouldn't, but it
I
does.
agree. I agree. And of course, that's where the Edison quote, it's like, no, I don't even, in a sense, his quote says, I don't even acknowledge those experiments that didn't work as failures. They were just little discoveries. I did experiment or play around in my head with the idea that instead of basic failures, complex failures, and intelligent failures, I could just give you three different terms, which it would be mistakes, accidents, and discoveries. But then it just felt like a little too much happy talk, right? Because again, let's go back to Bob or George, those scientists whose well-intended and super smart hypotheses turned out to be wrong. Those are difficult days.
Hmm.
I mean, you pick yourself up and you figure out, okay, what did we learn? And then what's the next experiment? And I still want to get faster to that Nobel Prize or whatever, that top journal publication than someone else. But it just, I decided, I mean, I like those three terms, mistakes, accidents, and discoveries. But I thought, no, I got to confront it head on because of the disappointment.
I'm glad you did. Well, I'm going to give you a compliment, even though you sort of deflected it earlier. I'm going to do it again, which is, and I get where you're coming from, but you didn't coin psychological safety. Fair enough. I think it was your book, Fearless Organization. You certainly brought it to the mainstream. And not the perfect analogy here, but most people think that Malcolm Gladwell is the one that came up with this 10,000 hour rule. No, it was someone named Anders Ericsson, who I also interviewed on the podcast a few years ago. But Malcolm Gladwell took it
Right.
and popularized it as you have. And now I think a large portion of our working population understand that term and why it's so important. So from that to this notion of intelligent failure in this book you've written, what are you hoping people will get out of it? What are you hoping will change as a result?
Well, I do hope very much that we can change the conversation in organizations from the kind of chaotic, fail fast, fail often, that's context free and clearly not good advice for the operating room, for instance, versus, oh, I'm sorry, I live in the real world, we can't do that, to a more nuanced, thoughtful, scientific discussion around failure, where it's good, where it isn't, how to have more of the good kind, how to have less of the bad kind, right? So that's kind of the change that conversation and not have such silly magical thinking on this topic. And the title of the last chapter is Thriving as a Fallible Human Being. So probably the deeper message is each and every one of us is, by definition, a fallible human being. Can we live with that? Right? Can we live with that joyfully? Is that even a possibility? I mean, it has to be, because otherwise we're either, denying it and trying to act as if it isn't true, or wallowing in misery because we're so fallible. But yes, we're fallible. That's how we were designed, so that we could keep on learning. So I'm hoping just to have more joyful, thoughtful, even humorous conversations about our fallibility.
I like it. Do you think today, do you feel that you're quote unquote good at failing, or is that still something you continue to work on?
I think I still struggle with it. I have a lot more experience doing it, but I still struggle with it.
Well, you already partially answered this, but I'll ask it again. The podcast here, The Art of Excellence. Take that word excellence, define it any way you'd like to.
Well, I'll give you a slightly different answer, but it's not inconsistent with my prior answer, which was that it should be, performance over the longer term. Mm-hmm. But the way I think about excellence is, there's success, right? I won't put it that way. There's getting ahead, right? In your field, maybe financially, what have you, whatever, getting ahead. That's one dimension of life. And the other is making a difference. And to me, excellence is doing as well as you can in your chosen area and making a positive difference. And that could be a positive difference to one other person's life, or that could be a positive difference to a larger number of people or systems in the community or in the world. So I very much want to frame it around positive impact on others.
That's brilliant. I love it. I got to tell you, I love the book. And I
Thank
mean
you.
that. I read cover to cover anyone I talk to. But I'll be honest, when I saw what the topic was, I'm like, I already know failure's good. I know this. I've got this. I do recruiting for mostly tech companies. Fail fast, fail hard, all that. And I'll tell you, you do such a nice job of dissecting, again, the good from the bad. How do we get better at it? How do we learn? Lots and lots of examples across. I loved it. And I don't know, that's a lot of work and a lot of effort to pull that off. So I hope it's a wonderful success, however you define that. But I honestly learned a lot. I hope my listeners will go out and buy the book. Amy, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. Absolutely loved it.
Well, thank you. This is the most fun I've had all day, by far.
Hey, thanks for listening. Okay, don't go yet, please. 2 favors. I ask simply 2 favors. One, if you could please download the iTunes app. You could do it on your phone. You can do it on the computer. Take 60 seconds and leave a review. It means a lot. 2, you can find my episodes on several social media sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Find the one that you like the most. Find the one where you tend to have a lot of friends and followers. And if you could please either share it in the case of Facebook and LinkedIn, or retweet it on Twitter, that would mean the world to me. So those are the 2 asks I have. I love putting together this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.